Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska, and my guest today is Amanda Cole, who is an Australian performer, researcher, writer, and music educator. She's a research fellow at Griffith University in Brisbane, right? Is Brisbane? And she's won numerous
Brisbane is
Brisbane.
funny
Oh, yeah.
Australian
Don't want to say it
pronunciation.
wrong.
Melbourne and Brisbane.
Brisbane, and she
Yeah.
has won numerous awards for creative projects, research projects, and professional development. She has a doctorate in performing arts pedagogy from Griffith University and a master's of music from the University of Melbourne. And she is, I would call, a very serious student and researcher about the Alexander technique. She's had lots of lessons. I think initially maybe the Walter Carrington tradition,
Mhm.
but then later she studied a lot with Kathy Madden, and that would be very much in the Marjorie Barstow tradition. And Amanda has done an incredible research job of locating letters between, well, a number of people, but I'd like to focus on four. Alexander himself, FM, Marjorie Barstow, Frank Pierce Jones, and John Dewey. And I'd like to just say a short word about each one of those so we kind of have a context. I see these four being completely intertwined in terms of communication. FM, I would put FM at the center of a circle and the other three around it. So FM is FM Alexander, the founder of the Alexander technique. And the other three, Marjorie Barstow was the first person to graduate from Alexander's first training course in the 1930s. She taught extensively with Alexander's brother, A.R. Alexander, in Boston and New York, and spent most of her life in Lincoln, Nebraska, eventually becoming quite famous for her large groups starting around in the early 70s. So she became quite an important player in the Alexander world. Frank Pierce Jones was a professor of classics at Tufts University and somehow discovered the Alexander technique. And I believe Marge Barstow was the one who encouraged him to do teacher training, to become a teacher. Is that
Right.
correct? And
Um, no, I think Dewey encouraged him.
Dewey may have. In any
Yeah,
event,
I think
Marge,
Marge only met Pierce Jones after he started the training, I think.
okay. But
Mm.
anyway, Jones, so that's Marge and Frank Pierce Jones. And then we have John Dewey, who's not exactly a household word today, but he certainly was in the first half of the 20th century. He was a public intellectual, uh, professor, I believe, at the Columbia University Teachers College, very, very influential in the development of American public education. He is sometimes called the father of American public education. And in addition, he was America, and probably still is, America's most famous philosopher, his field being pragmatism. So these four, what you've uncovered is correspondence, written correspondence between these four. All of them corresponded one way or another with FM, and they mostly corresponded with each other as well.
Mhm.
And these letters show a very different, let's say, version of well, I got sunlight coming in here, so I'm working to keep myself behind the center. Present a very different, I would say, a different history of the development of the Alexander technique, say from the 40s to I don't know, the 80s, I guess.
Yep.
And I wonder if you could summarize what's new that really changes our understanding of how things emerged over that period.
Okay. Before I do that, just while you were speaking, I just had a couple of thoughts just to add into the mix. So, when you were talking about my biog, I'm not sure where you got that from, the book,
Back
possibly.
of the book.
All right. So interesting. So that in that I left out the fact that I also have a master's of teaching.
Okay.
And that's only interesting because my main focus in writing this book is to remind people that the Alexander technique is actually a method of education rather than of treatment. And then when you were talking about Frank Pierce Jones being a professor of classics, and we both kind of laughed at the kind of randomness of that, but him being such a great Alexander teacher, I suddenly thought, and what I'm teaching at the moment is French. So I also have that in common with Frank Pierce Jones. I just thought that was kind of a nice little,
right.
I don't know, connection. And then I also just wanted to show you this. That's my version of the diagram that you were talking about.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
But you put Alexander in the center, which is quite feasible, but because my book's about Marge, I put Marge in the center.
You put Marge in the center for this book, but I would say big picture, maybe FM.
Big picture, Alexander
is the one
and
that they
on the cover.
Yeah.
And then the third thing that I just wanted to mention is that while Dewey's not a household name anymore, he's certainly still very central in discussions about education, which I discovered when I did my master's. I did my master of teaching after I did my PhD. And I had to write all these things about education theory, and I realized I'd already done this in my PhD about John Dewey. So he's still very influential in terms of education today.
Right.
And yeah. Now, so what was your question again?
Well, what's
summarize
the
development?
Big picture change in our understanding of how the technique developed, at least amongst those four people during this period, that seems like quite at variance from what I think sort of standard biographies would indicate.
Yes. Well, again, what I would say is that while Alexander's importance is absolutely central, and he was the founder of the technique,
right?
And while he said in letters that he had gone way forward to Marge, Marge wanted to get Alexander to recognize Frank Jones as the authority on the Alexander technique. This is her humility, that she didn't put herself forward, even though she'd been mentoring Frank Pierce Jones for decades on how to teach and all sorts of things. She then advocated for Frank Pierce Jones to Alexander and said, why don't you name him your emissary, And the response was, well, no, because neither of you understand how far ahead we've gone in recent years in England. So you just don't understand. You're not actually teaching the Alexander technique anymore. But what my research suggests, and what Marge's teaching practice also suggests, is that Marge and Frank focused on the educative aspects of the Alexander technique, whereas Alexander started focusing on the therapeutic aspects. And so that's where they started to diverge, is in a nutshell.
Right. And I think there's a famous quote from Alexander, now I can do it for them, using his hand.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not something that Marge would ever think or say. And I don't think Frank Pierce Jones would either, from what I know.
No.
Yeah. So.
No, they were totally aligned, Marge and Frank, in terms of what they thought the Alexander technique was about.
Right. And what would you say they thought it was about?
About educating someone to. Well, actually, I really like one of Kathy Madden's ways of describing the Alexander technique, which is cooperation with human design. And I think that that's what Marge and Frank were focused on teaching people to how to do.
So
and teaching them how to
basically,
teach
teaching
themselves how to do
people
it.
how to use, let's say, Alexander's discoveries, if we want to call it that, use that themselves for their own betterment.
Yes.
And the model being you would teach them, and then they would learn how to do this, and they would at some point become relatively independent of a teacher, which in my experience is not exactly how it often works in more traditional Alexander teaching. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
I mean, you've had
Yeah.
quite a bit of experience with that. So very interested in education, both of them. And of course, Dewey was very interested in education because that was his whole thing, basically, apart from the pragmatism stuff. But even there, you've made the point that pragmatism, that the philosophy of pragmatism, kind of ties into this, and that really both Frank Pierce Jones and Marge were implicitly doing some of the things that pragmatism would suggest would be a good idea.
Yes, definitely. And Dewey
that's a
also,
way to phrase it.
Yeah. So Frank had a closer alliance with John Dewey. Like they actually were friends, and they spent time together and went to visited each other and wrote to each other and talked about pragmatism and the Alexander technique. Marge had less of a connection with him, but my thesis is that she knew about Dewey. She'd read Dewey's books. She wrote, actually, I mean, I surmised this and I wished I could have known. And I asked people, did you ever see Dewey's books in Marge's library? No one could remember. But then, so I was so excited when I found I've read Art as Experience in a letter to Frank Pierce Jones, and I agree with a lot of things in it. So she was a great reader, as you know, but she also, I think, just intuitively did a lot of things in terms of what Dewey, that aligned with what Dewey had written about. And before I forget, I just wanted to say that Dewey, when people called him an educator and he's become known for education, but when people talked about him being an educator, he said, "I'm just trying to think. That's all I'm trying to do." He was more he was about thinking. So and that's also what I think, my experience of the difference between the two, broadly speaking, the two strands of the Alexander technique and how it's taught. That's what differentiates them, is one's more about thinking, and the Marge and Frank had a much bigger emphasis on thinking and observing, and all the other things that I write about in the book, but thinking, rather than moving through stuff first, that actually thinking about what is required, and thinking about how we can do this better, and thinking about what isn't working and what can we change to make it better. And that's where that's the pragmatism as well. That's philosophical pragmatism, or just pragmatism, is from thinking about and observing, and and that's, again, ties in with the scientific process, which is what Alexander did in his original process of discovery, and what Dewey recognized in Alexander as being scientific process.
Right. But in terms of what they actually did when they were teaching and people they were training, the emphasis, I think, would be on things like, really having good hands to guide people, to somewhat do it for them. And yes, at some point, of course, they would start to be able to do some themselves, maybe, but it might be tricky for them to take what they learned in a standard lesson into their daily activities. Whereas Marge, for sure, started right with the daily activities, and in particular, the activities people wanted to do better.
Yeah.
So, of course, she had a lot of performing actors, dancers, and so on. who they had a great interest in improving the way they did what they did for their work. So very different orientation in terms of why are we even having an Alexander lesson kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I should also, I said something just before that probably is not very clear. I said something about thinking rather than moving. What I mean is thinking rather than feeling through something, because Marge was also into movement way more than the other school. So the other school was talks about inhibition and not doing, whereas Marge was thinking and doing together. And actually, I don't know if you've read Kathy's book where she invents a word that actually combines thinking and moving together.
Right. So that's also... and of course, Marge would argue, or had specifically said on some occasions when people would ask her, well, how come you never talk about inhibition? And I remember one time when she said, well, that's all I ever talk about. And but she had I'd say maybe a little different idea of what inhibition meant.
Yeah.
Which we maybe could get into more. Is there anything else sort of big picture that you want to talk about? And then I have some ideas for more specific topics, but
sure. Well, I divided the book into chapters aligned with, well, they're part 2 anyway, aligned with what I called it is Dewey's principles in Bastow's teaching. So if I just read you out those titles, that will basically give you the big picture of what I see as
sure.
the defining features of Marge's teaching. So one is making ideas clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about how she was, and that was, so Dewey had the idea in philosophy of making ideas clear instead of making it really hard to understand. That was his mission, and I saw Marge as doing the same thing with saying, what is the Alexander technique? What are we trying to do here? Let's make this clear so that we can actually have a plan that everyone understands, instead of it being this mystical, mysterious, confusing thing. Right. Then the second one I called reconstruction, because Dewey was, one of the things Dewey did was reconstruct philosophy to make it about what he called the problems of men instead of a kind of abstract thing. Mm-hmm. And I just then connected that with Marge's reconstruction of Alexander's principles and terms. So instead of using some of the principles, the principles such as primary control and inhibition and direction and directions and positions of mechanical advantage and sensory re-education, she really questioned what they were about and clarified what she thought he was really trying to do. And in many ways, I think better than he did himself.
I think absolutely better. Yeah, absolutely.
And then the third big category was what I call desire, application, and art. So where I think that the Carrington School of Teaching can lose the end by focusing so much on not end gaming. Mm-hmm. They lose the point of why we're doing this, and the Alexander technique then becomes an end in itself, and you end up just spending hours just kind of sitting, not moving, not doing anything, so that you're inhibiting and you're not really going anywhere. So right. I'm talking about the reason that performing artists actually pick up the Alexander technique is because they love what they do and they want to do it better. They don't pick up the Alexander technique to master the Alexander technique. So right. That's where I saw.
And interestingly enough, that really harkens back to FM's initial self-experiments. He wasn't trying to develop a theory of mind-body. No. He wanted to get back on stage. Yeah, exactly. A very specific and practical issue he was dealing with.
Yeah,
I think Marge very much aligned with that. What are you going to do? You got this problem. Alexander made some interesting discoveries that could probably help you, but we want to, as it were, deliver it to you in a way that will get you starting to think about it, think about the kind of experiments you would make on your own, take it, apply it to various activities in your life. And that is not at all how most traditionally trained, at least when I was in England, that would not have been the way a lesson was conducted for the most part.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And then the the last big category I talk about is democracy in the social context, which is what Dewey wrote a lot about, democracy in education, and so the way I connected that to what Marge was doing was her group teaching and all that went along with that, community and communication, and it just fit beautifully into Dewey and Marge just fitted together beautifully. This is when I was writing my PhD, that and the way I found these categories was by reading the book that you all contributed to, that Barbara Conable edited, what I call the Festschrift, and I read that and I collected all the themes, and as I was collecting the themes, I also discovered Dewey from Terry Fitzgerald's PhD about teacher training.
So he's a teacher in where, Sydney?
He's in Sydney, yeah.
Sydney, and he's an Alexander teacher there. And the book you're talking about was like a project to celebrate Marge's 90th birthday. So all of those people who were kind of around Marge more than just one or two workshops, but were sort of regular students of hers, many of us wrote little essays basically about how we viewed what we had learned, and just they're all quite different. They're really an interesting read, and
yes,
they do give some pretty interesting insights into what Marge was all about.
Exactly, and I suppose the crux of that aspect of her teaching was remembering that the Alexander technique started out as something to help Alexander communicate. And in my lessons, my early lessons in the Alexander technique, I definitely forgot that. That was not front and center. And yet it always is in my lessons with Marjorie Barstow trained people.
Right. Well, let's unless there's something else very big picture you want to talk about, we could end this conversation. And if we have time, I have a couple of directions we could delve into more deeply. If that works.
Okay. There's the other, I suppose the other big picture thing is, like you mentioned, the constellation, and I would talk I could talk a long time about the problem with Alexander's technique and education versus treatment. But the final thing that for me that defined Marge's teaching is, and I should say I never met her, she died before I started this research, but right. I have watched her teach on video, I've listened to her speak, I've read interviews with her, and I've talked to a lot of people who studied with her, and I've read her letters, as you said, is what I call integration. So the art and integration of teaching and training, which is something that she did more than any other teacher last century. That seems to be changing now, but so yeah.
Well,
that was crucial to her whole approach to the Alexander technique, was that training wasn't something separate.
Right. Was in her groups, sometimes quite large, there would be some people who had never heard of the Alexander technique until they arrived the first day. And there were people who had been teachers for many years, and all ranges, all categories in between. And interestingly enough, if you didn't really know who was who, you might have a hard time figuring it out. But one tip-off would be, and this fits into what you were talking about earlier, Marge would typically, at various points, say, well, who wants to work on something, an activity? And most everyone had something they wanted to work on. The one exception would be most of the teachers who the only activity they could ever conceive of might be, well, could you help me with my teaching? Which was a very tricky pathway to go in those classes, because you were really asking for it if you asked for that. For the most part, and there were lots of exceptions, but teachers were a little at a loss to come up with things.
Right.
I myself was somewhat at a loss. I was halfway through a regular training course, no matter. And I thought, well, what would I like to do better other than be a better teacher when I graduate? And I reverted back to my love of country music, and I thought, okay, I'll just get up and sing. Because that is something I really enjoyed doing. I'm a terrible singer, but I was interested in how could I sing better?
Right.
So that would be often my activity.
What was your, I know this isn't the focus of this interview, but I don't remember what drove you to decide to study the Alexander technique.
I heard that she worked with groups. That was the sort of minor buzz in London at that time. And I thought,
but what made you go to London to study it? Like,
I went because I had
a
a very powerful experience with a teacher. It just totally transformed my physicality, for sure.
Right.
And at some point I thought, this seems a lot more interesting than what I'm doing now. And where do you go? Back then you went to London, or you might go to San Francisco, but mostly you went to London. And that's why I went. And I, of course, knew nothing about any of this history, but I did hear about this lady in Nebraska who taught big groups. And I thought, I wonder how she does that. And I went out one winter and I got hooked by it. Because yes, she was working with big groups, but in a way that wasn't the biggest difference. These other things that you've been talking about. So, well, let's stop there if that's okay, and then maybe we could resume with another related topic. So, my guest today is Amanda Cole, and we will be back with another podcast or so. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Robert.